I moved into a new neighborhood 6 months ago. It was a quiet area, perfect for the fresh start I needed. Most of the homes were close to identical, well kept with neatly trimmed lawns. My neighbors were polite but mostly kept to themselves, except for one man across the street. He was about 60, with graying hair and a permanent frown etched into his face. He lived alone, and I'd often catch him watching from his window, staring at my house for hours. I assumed he was just a lonely old man, but something about the intensity of his gaze unsettled me. I tried to ignore it and focus on settling in. But soon, strange things started happening. One night, as I was taking out the trash, I noticed something odd on my front porch. A small pile of dirt, almost like a mound, right near my door. I thought it was a prank, so I brushed it off and went back inside. But the next night, it happened again. And the night after that. Every night, I'd find another small pile of dirt on my porch. One evening, I finally caught him. I saw him from my window, shuffling across the street in the dead of night, stopping to place the dirt on my porch before he slowly turned and walked back to his house. I was livid, so I decided to confront him. The next day, I knocked on his door. He answered, peering out with those cold, dark eyes. I kept my tone calm and asked him why he was leaving dirt on my porch every night. He stared at me, unblinking, before finally speaking in a low, gravelly voice. "It's to protect you." "Protect me? From what?" I asked, completely baffled. "From her," he replied, his gaze shifting past me to the tree line behind my house. He didn't elaborate. Instead, he shut the door in my face, leaving me standing there, more confused and unnerved than ever. That night, I stayed up late, peering through my curtains, trying to make sense of his cryptic warning. Around midnight, I saw a movement near the trees. It was a figure, a woman with long, tangled hair, dressed in a tattered white gown. She stood just at the edge of the tree line, swaying slightly, her eyes fixed on my house. My heart pounded as she took a few slow, deliberate steps forward, her gaze never leaving my window. Then, just as she reached the edge of my yard, she stopped and stared down at the small pile of dirt on my porch. She hissed, almost as if in pain, and slowly backed away into the shadows. The next morning, I went back to the old man's house. This time, he didn't answer. His curtains were drawn, and his house looked abandoned, as if no one had lived there for years. I asked some of the other neighbors about him, but they just gave me blank looks. They said the house had been empty for over a decade. Since then, every night, I leave a small pile of dirt on my porch. And every night, from the corner of my eye, I see her standing at the tree line watching, waiting. There was an old man who always sat by his window. His eyes followed my every move. Whether I was getting my mail, mowing the lawn, or just sitting on the porch, he was always there, watching with a blank, almost vacant stare. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off, assuming he was just lonely or bored. One night, I was woken by a soft, scratching noise at my front door. My heart pounded as I sat up, listening. The scratching grew louder, more desperate. Summoning the courage, I flicked on the porch light and peered through the window. But no one was there, just faint scratch marks on the wood. The next day, I tried to catch the old man's eye, hoping he'd have some explanation. But he simply stared back with that cold, vacant look, as if he knew something I didn't. A few nights later, I woke up to a strange smell. Dirt, heavy and damp, like a freshly dug grave. I followed it to my front porch and found a neat pile of soil right at my doorstep. Someone had placed it there carefully. As I looked around, a figure caught my eye. It was the old man, standing at his window in the dark, staring at me with a slight, knowing smile. The next day, I decided to confront him, but when I knocked, there was no answer. I called his name and even peeked through a window, but the house looked empty and abandoned, covered in dust and shadows. Yet, I'd just seen him hours before. That night, I placed a new lock on my door and tried to sleep. But around midnight, I was startled awake by a woman's scream, coming from across the street. It was raw, chilling, and filled with terror. I raced to the window, expecting to see lights or movement, but everything was still and silent. The scream faded into the night as if it had never happened. The next morning, I tried asking the neighbors about the old man, hoping someone had answers. One woman looked at me with a strange, pitying expression and said, "That house has been empty for years. The man who lived there died a long time ago. I haven't slept well since. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that scratching at the door and catch a glimpse of movement in his old window. But I don't dare go outside. I moved into a quiet neighborhood about a month ago. It seemed perfect, safe, friendly, and peaceful. But from the first day, I noticed my neighbor across the street, an older man who seemed to watch me constantly from his front window. His stare was intense, like he was studying my every move. I tried to ignore it at first, assuming he was just curious about the new person in town. Then strange things started happening. One night, I was lying in bed, just about to fall asleep, when I heard a scratching at my front door. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. I sat up, heart pounding, and waited. After a few minutes, it stopped, and I convinced myself it was just the wind or a stray animal. But the next morning, I found a small pile of soil in front of my door, neat and deliberate. As I stared at it, trying to make sense of it, I glanced across the street, and there he was, staring again, his face hidden partially behind the curtains. That's when I started to feel like I was being watched constantly, not just when I was outside, but even when I was in my own home. Over the next few days, I tried to shake it off. I closed my blinds, kept my lights low, and stayed out of sight. But one night, just as I was finally drifting off to sleep, I heard a scream, a sharp, chilling cry that cut through the quiet night. I jumped up and ran to my window, looking out into the street. It was completely silent. Dark. No sign of anyone. But there, in the shadow of his house, I saw him again, the neighbor, staring right at me through his window. His face was blank, expressionless, almost hollow. I shut my blinds, heart racing, and stayed up the rest of the night, too scared to sleep. The next morning, I decided to confront him, but when I went across the street, I realized something shocking. His house was abandoned. The windows were dusty, the lawn overgrown. It looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. I asked a nearby neighbor, and they told me that the man who used to live there passed away years ago. I don't know who or what was staring at me through that window. But I do know one thing. Since that day, I can still feel eyes watching me from the empty house across the street.